Our scripture reading this morning is very short. It is just one verse. This comes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. It's a very common saying in the ancient world, but it's going to be perplexing to us. So just kind of stick with me during the sermon this morning. It says this: "Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and then turn and tear you to pieces." Like I said, a very strange text. And so I want to begin by saying what I always say at the beginning of every sermon, which is that pilgrim sermons are meant to start discussions, not end them. The goal in my mind is not for us to leave here agreeing on every dogma and doctrine, but rather for us to think critically about what we believe, and through that process become more loving, Christ-like people. And so with that being said, I want to kind of read this verse again in another translation. It says, "Do not give to dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them underfoot and turn and maul you." And most of us read that, and we just go, what did I just read? It's very confusing. Like I said, it was a very common saying in the ancient world, but to us it is very foreign. And so I just want us to kind of think a little bit about what he's saying here. First, about dogs. Now, my wife and I, we have two dogs. One of them is a black lab. Actually, he's a Labradane, we believe, part lab, part Great Dane. And so if you ever see him in person, he's the biggest lab you've ever seen, which is why we think he might be part Great Dane. So we have a Labradane named Baloo, and we have a Beagle named Drew. Now, and both of them came from very interesting backgrounds. They actually both came from South Korea, where one, Drew, was actually in a lab being tested on. And so he was rescued from that sort of situation. And Baloo was actually on his way to a slaughterhouse. He was on a meat truck to be sold and bought as meat. And so he was rescued by a good Samaritan who kind of stepped in front of the truck and saved them there. And so they kind of both come from trauma, more so Drew, who was in the lab. Baloo had no idea. He was on the truck and he was just having a good time, I'm sure. He had no idea where he was heading to. And I tell you this because they are very, very smart dogs. But at the same time, I often joke that there's kind of one brain cell between the two of them, because they can do, even though they're smart for dogs, they can still do kind of some stupid things sometimes. And so I tell you this because that idea of do not give what is holy to dogs, we have to really think of, well, what did the biblical authors think of dogs? Because we in the modern world, when we think of dogs, we think of our pets, we think of these lovely creatures that we welcome into our home. You know, my dogs sleep in bed with us, like they're very comfortable and they're part of the family essentially. But that is not what the ancient authors would have thought of when they thought of dogs. They did not typically have them as pets. And so one verse that really kind of brings this to light is Proverbs chapter 26, verse 11. And it says, "Like a dog that returns to its vomit is a fool who reverts to his foolishness." I don't know if you guys have ever seen that happen. It's definitely happened with my dogs, where they throw up and then they immediately try to eat it. And then sometimes we'll succeed in that. And so this is what this verse is getting at. Like a dog that returns to its vomit is a fool who reverts to his foolishness. And so in the ancient world, dogs were synonymous with foolishness. And so Jesus is saying, don't give what is holy to a fool, is essentially what he is saying. But what about pigs? Now, I don't know about you, but I've never had pigs, even though my wife and I both love animals so much. We've never had pigs. We've never had pet pigs, although I have known people who have had pet pigs. But it says here, "Do not throw your pearls before swine." And so just like we did with dogs, I think we have to ask, well, what did the biblical authors think of pigs? And if you read the Hebrew scriptures, there are lists of clean and unclean animals in the ancient world. And one of the unclean animals were pigs. Pigs were considered unclean. You were not to touch them. You were not to eat them. If you did touch them or eat them, you were considered unclean, and you really had to then go through a ceremonial purifying process. And so this is what Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about pigs and dogs. Both were considered either foolish or unclean, and he's saying, don't give what is holy to dogs. Don't give pearls to pigs. pearls in the ancient world, pearls were a symbol of something very specific. Pearls represented in Jewish culture the Torah, which were the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. It represented the teachings of the Jewish tradition: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. But we typically think of, when we think of the Torah, of just those 5, but they would have spoken of the Torah of just kind of symbolizing all of the Jewish teachings. And so when Jesus says all of this, he's making a very specific idea. Essentially what he's saying is, don't present a foolish person with your best wisdom. And don't present a foolish person with the beauty of your faith, because it will only end badly. I don't know about you guys, but if you've ever been online in the comments section, it's not a pleasant experience. And anytime it's like, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, if somebody posts something controversial, the comments get heated. And naturally, if you get into controversial discussion in person, it can get heated. But when you're behind a screen and a keyboard, it becomes way easier to say heinous things to someone that you maybe wouldn't say in person. In fact, some people like to go online and they like to kind of stir the pot a little bit. And they may not even have a stake in the discussion, but they just want to say something that will just rub someone the wrong way, and then they'll leave the conversation from there and just watch the comments ensue. And these are often, in internet terms, are referred to as trolls. These are people, like the verb is they are trolling you when they're just trying to mess with you and just post something that will annoy you and rub you the wrong way. And like I said, this happens on all different forms of social media. It is very, very common to do this. And so one of my friends kind of paraphrased this before of this whole section of what Jesus' teachings is: don't feed the trolls. Don't give them stuff to work with in this conversation. Because responding to a troll, whether in person or online, it simply makes the situation worse. In fact, it's impossible to make someone value the things that you value or do the things that you want them to do if they don't want to. And this is what Jesus is getting at here. It's just this idea of how responding to a troll, whether in person or online, simply makes the situation worse. They often just get angry, they get frustrated, and just things escalate way quicker than you thought they would. And so Jesus is kind of telling us here to not try to control people, especially people who are trolls, especially people who respond this way to different things. Because if you try to control people, if you try to make someone online see the way that you view things, it often just escalates. And so Jesus is kind of saying that there's wisdom in not trying to control people in this way, and in not trying to make someone see the beauty that you see in the world, and trying to make someone view things from your perspective. That sometimes that can be an endless pursuit, but sometimes that can not be super helpful. And I tell you this because as a pastor, I can tell you there have been so many times I've sat down and just in one-on-one conversations or group conversations or even kind of pastoral care, and someone kind of asked the question, well, how do I get my family member to view things the way I view the world? Or how do I get my family member to accept how I live? How do I get my friend to change what they're doing? And ultimately, we have in our minds that if we could just say the right thing, if we could just say the right thing, then that person will change their minds and their actions. And that, unfortunately, I'd like for it to be true, but it's not always true. In fact, this is why Jesus is saying here, do not give what is holy to dogs, do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them underfoot and turn and maul you. This is a very intense idea. What Jesus is trying to say here is not only will people not do what you want them to do if you try to get them to change their mind and perspective and way of living, but they will likely get angry or frustrated with you. It will only end badly. And so Jesus is trying to advise us to not try to control people for multiple reasons, because it's not helpful for them and it's not helpful for us either. But when I say don't try to control people, the immediate question is, well, how do I do that? Because that's a very difficult thing to go from wanting to change someone's mind, just because we care so deeply about people, we care so deeply about the things that we care about, that we maybe have had certain ways of living that have been super beneficial to us. And so we want to make sure that everyone else benefits from that same thing. But it's often very difficult to do that because, like I said, it doesn't end well. And so Jesus says, don't try to control people. And so how do we do that? And I think that's the interior work of prayer. Amen. I think it's through prayer that we get to a point where we don't feel the need to control people anymore, where we get to a point where we feel like we can let go of that need. And we can let go of, hey, there are people who view the world differently than I do, and there are people who live differently than I do. And I think through prayer that becomes easier and easier to accept. And perhaps even through prayer, while we can't change people, I think God can change people. And so that's something that can potentially make a difference in that way. And so I want to kind of finish with reading this particular quote here from Reinhold Niebuhr. He was this famous theologian, just brilliant, brilliant mind. And when he talked about a script for prayer, he said something that has actually become very common in AA and NA, but I think it's a prayer that is just helpful across the board, especially when it comes to thinking about how we get to a point of not wanting to control people, how we get to a point of just having an open hand with saying, hey, some people view the world differently than I do, some people live differently than I do. And so Reinhold Niebuhr says this. His prayer is, God, grant me the serenity to accept things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now, I've prayed that prayer many times, but the thing I want to highlight there is the wisdom to know the difference. Because there are many times where there are things that we can change and there are things that we cannot change. And I think sometimes our task in changing people is often something we cannot change. We can change our own way of viewing things. We can change ourselves, but to try to change someone else is not a task that is worth pursuing. And so, my friends, may we be a people who embrace the differences in one another. May we be a people who embrace that some people view the world differently than us. May we be people who embrace that some people live differently than us. And may we hold things with an open hand and not try to change or control people. Amen.